Hello and welcome to a new episode of After the Amen podcast. I'm Benjamin Lee. Joined here with me is Miles Hester. We've had some technical difficulties, so no intro today, but that's all right. Miles and I will be able to handle this just fine. Thank you so much for listening wherever you may be. Miles, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. Like we were just talking about, it's a little cold here in North Texas, cold for North Texas at least. But we're doing good. Great sermon yesterday. So
Yeah,
excited to talk
yeah.
about it.
Yeah, ready to go. Yeah, North Texas is always interesting, Miles. We had Snowmageddon a couple of years ago. So, you and Claire never know what you're going to get up here, but high winds, snow, heat. You've already experienced the heat. So
Mhm.
glad that you brought some sweaters along with you
Right,
from Tampa. That's always good. You were prepared.
right.
Yeah, so
Had to be.
let's dive into the sermon a little bit.
Okay. So we're talking today about Ben's sermon that he preached yesterday. We're recording this on a Monday. Oh God, you are my God, taken from Psalm 63. So we'll go ahead and if you're listening and you'd like to follow along, you can turn to Psalm 63. But I know the three main verses we keyed in on were Psalm 63, verse 1, "O God, you are my God," where the title's taken from. Psalm 63 and verse 2, talking about gazing upon God in his sanctuary or looking upon God in his sanctuary. And then Psalm 63 and verse 7, "For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy." Just to get started, um, I just said where the title came from, but what made you want to preach about Psalm 63 and what made you choose these verses to focus on?
Well, last week, I had a lot of different ideas about what I wanted to preach. I put together a calendar at the beginning of the year about certain sermons, and I
Mm-hmm.
talked to you quite a bit about the sermon. And this time of year is always it's always an interesting time of year with just the holiday season. We've had a lot of suffering here at the congregation with a variety of things that have happened the last couple of months. And actually, Nikki, my wife, had texted me this passage last week, and so it really caught my attention about something good to focus on for me to focus on. Obviously, she was already thinking about that. She's done some studies in the Psalms as well, so I decided to preach from this sermon or from this passage in Psalm 63. I thought it was appropriate for just a variety of really for all of us where people's family situations are different. The holiday season's a great time. I've talked about that in the sermon. Yet this also can be a very challenging time for a lot of people. There's a lot of people in the United States and for the world, for that matter, that are lonely, that are widows, that have lost people, and we've had some family dynamics here at the congregation as well that have been really unsettling too. And just a lot of people, health issues. And we've seen that in both of our families as well, this year. So, this sermon here, my hope and prayer was for it to be encouraging, was for it to be um, a way to give us strength. This idea of, oh God, you are my God. That's what David penned in Psalm 63. The superscription says that he was in the wilderness, so pointing us back to, I believe, when he was on the run from King Saul. When you read this psalm, there's a lot here that speaks of David's relationship that certainly will translate to our lives today. We serve the same God. One of the things that David did, even in the midst of being on the run, he's still worshiping God. He's still trusting God. He still has joy rooted in his heart. I think that's one of the biggest things to take away from this study. If you read Psalm 63 on your own, David's going to find his vindication. I didn't read the last couple of verses, but he's going to find his vindication in the Lord. He's going to wait upon the Lord. Something that really impressed me was verse 3. My lips will praise you. Verse 5, and my mouth offers praises with joyful lips. In verse 7, for you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I sing for joy. So 3 times there's this emphasis upon worshiping God. He's looking to God or gazing upon God in the sanctuary, and there's joy at the root of all of it. So for me, Miles, that's something that really has encouraged me And I know you and I have spoken about this. There's a lot of practical things we can take away from this psalm as well.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about. I mentioned before we were recording that one of my favorite kind of aspects of the sermon, which isn't directly from Psalm 63, but just because it's this time of year, um, family dynamics can be kind of weird at the holidays. There's a lot of different things that can kind of come up, or people are struggling. This is their first um, Christmas without a loved one, or their first holiday season since something traumatic has happened, and that can be really difficult. But two things I actually wrote down a direct quote from your sermon
Mm.
in the margin of Psalm 63. You said at one point, you're going to have times where you're going to want to cry out to something. You're going to turn to something. You better turn to God. And I
Mm.
thought that was a really good kind of perspective on this psalm, just because that's just true. We're all, and it's interesting because people in the world will kind of take that and use that as like, well, nobody really knows that what we're doing. We're all just kind of doing our best, but that's just not true for Christians. We know exactly who we're crying out to, and obviously we don't fully understand how he works at all times, but we know where to turn when we have these times where we want to cry out to something, we want to worship something, we need something solid to cling to, and as you said, it better be God. But another thing about that was in verse 2, talking about the sanctuary and beholding the power and the glory of God. I hadn't thought about this in reading. I don't think about this often when I read the Psalms, but one thing you mentioned was just how rich David was, and being a king, and even when everything happens with Bathsheba, one of the things God says to him is like, you could have had anything you wanted. Like, why did you have to do this? Like, you could have asked me and I would have given you anything you wanted. So you certainly didn't have to do what you just did. And just thinking about that idea of, and you said something along the lines of like, even with all the resources that David had at his disposal, he still needed God. And so again, both of those ideas are kind of related. Just kind of thinking about the title of the sermon, "Oh God, you are my God," and I think we come upon, and whether it's at the holidays or just things can happen at any time that maybe test whether or not God is our God, and whether or not we really think about God as our God, and is He going to be the one that we're going to cling to in those dark times or in those difficult times.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate those words and that perspective as well. When you were talking, I was thinking about Acts chapter 7 with Stephen as he's being murdered. He's crying out to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
He's trusting in God. I think about Paul and Silas. We've used this example before, but they're in the prison cell and they are singing praises, as David said in verse number 3, verse number 5, and verse number 7. Verse number 7.
Mm-hmm.
So it is possible, and you're right. It is something. I think everything just gets heightened during this time of year as well. We start to wind down. Things get busy, but at the same time, we kind of slow down a little bit. I think mentally, hopefully, for a little bit. Excuse me. So it was just a really encouraging text, both the text from Nikki and also the text here with the Word of God. Of God is our God. We must foster this relationship. We must grow in our relationship with God. David is just one of the best examples of this, of what this looks like. And it's a hard thing to do, especially upon, meditating upon the night watches and praying to God and singing with joy, where you have to really put that effort in. I think it coincides great with your sermon from last week about what is worship. And now we see this worship in action in real
Mm-hmm.
time. So, we talk about these concepts and things like that. And it's easy to do these spiritual disciplines, if you want to say, maybe like when you're offline, right? So when you go on vacation, you're offline. Yeah, you can read the Bible for hours, maybe on a cruise ship, maybe not, depending on how many activities you're partaking in.
Right.
But when we're on vacation and things like that, when we're quote unquote offline, maybe it's a little bit easier to lean into this. But in the real world, in real time, right, that's really where it has to be executed. That's what we see with King David. This is real time. He's in the wilderness. He's on the run. He's in caves. He's trying to figure out why Saul is suddenly against him and who can he trust. He's got to act mad at times to for self preservation. So just so many different things that David is experiencing, but his default mode is always going back to God. Oh God, you are my God. That's his default mode in that real time. And I think there's something to be said there. The hospital room, the text message, the phone call we get, the argument that maybe we get into, the diagnosis that we get, our family, our parents, you know what I mean? All these different things that just happen in a day. And to be able to still say, oh God, you are my God. I'm still going to sing to you. I'm still going to meditate. That really is a game changer.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think about verse 1 where he says, "O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water." Um, a lot of I feel like a lot of times these days people talk about being hungry, kind of in like a motivational way, where it's like I want to like be hungry for success or hungry for whatever. And sometimes we'll talk about hunger in a bad way, where we'll describe somebody as like money hungry or power hungry and things like that. But then in the Beatitudes, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." And so just kind of thinking about, I think that's a really convicting perspective to read from David, that, when I don't read my Bible, if I go a day without reading my Bible, or if I, don't stick to the reading plan super closely or something like that, do I feel like I'm in a weary land where there is no food or water? You know what I mean? Like being that famished and feeling that like, oh, I like something's wrong. I'm missing something, right? And so just kind of having that perspective of wanting God that much and needing God that much. In the same way, unfortunately, some people are, hungry for power, and their kind of twisted way that kind of sustains them, or these different um, perverted things that people can be hungry for. But just thinking about when it comes to worship, and when it comes to my relationship with God, and praying to Him and worshiping Him and singing for joy, like you pointed out in verse 7, when I don't do those things, or when maybe I'm coasting or something like that, um, do I feel destitute and hungry and thirsty, like I should, if I'm not doing those things?
Yeah, and these, the dry and weary land where there is no water, those are sometimes the big moments when we start to feel that way, or not start to feel that way, but those habits start to kind of dissipate or decrease, whatever, where we're not as focused. I was just thinking about if you're in the desert and there's no water and you start hallucinating. That's often what suffering does. That's what uncertainty often does, where we can, go down a path that there's really nothing there, although we think there is something there. So this is even more important, I think. And I think as we start thinking more about uh, practical things that we can take away from this and what the audience can take away, one big thing is our relationship with God must be present before we hit that dry and weary land.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second thing is maybe we do hit this dry and weary land and our relationship isn't where it's supposed to be. It could be that the dry and weary land where there is no water helps our relationship with God, because it forces us to go back to reliance upon Him and to see maybe the idols that we have built or the stories that we have told ourselves are not true at all. So it can be a backward and forth. It could be, okay, one, we need to make sure the relationship is strong. I was thinking about that too, Miles, with David. He was slaying giants as a young man. He's shepherding, he's slaying giants, and there's already such great confidence in him that made him stand out with Saul and Jonathan and the rest of the men, and even going against Goliath. And so he had that faith, and it just kept growing. And yet, for us, if we don't have that, it could be that maybe sometimes we are in this dry and weary land for that very purpose. to grow it. So those are a couple of thoughts that I'll share as well. My last big thought, and then I'll hand it over to you about any applications, and then we'll wrap up. I really appreciate verse 6. And you're right, Miles. A lot of people talk about stay hungry. I've talked about that, right? I was thinking about a podcast or a blog, stay hungry and stay full, where, you can use that in a lot of different ways, but there should be this hunger for us to learn more about God, and also being full where we're satisfied with God. I'm satisfied with him. I don't need to go someplace else to define this thing that quote unquote is missing in my life, because that's what he says in verse 5. My soul is satisfied. I wish I would have emphasized that more yesterday, Miles. That is the real satisfaction. Our souls, our houses, our cars, our clothing, our trips, our food, all of those things are temporary. And but the soul, that's really what I think a lot of people are really seeking for, that they don't really understand. The missing piece of a puzzle. How annoying is it to have this 1,000 piece puzzle and there's one piece missing? You're like, what? I have all the pieces. I checked the box. Where is it? That one piece. And it doesn't matter what else you put in that missing piece, it doesn't fit. Well, David understood what that missing piece was. It's God. And so that's why you could say my soul is satisfied. So taken away from this, when we understand that God is that missing piece, quote unquote missing piece, he is that piece, then that changes everything. I'll hand it over to you and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Just thinking about kind of continuing with this idea of being in a dry and weary land. And I liked what you said about sometimes maybe we're in those situations to help us get out of it, because we need to be in, maybe God sees that we need to be in a situation where we kind of have nothing else to rely on except him, to drive home the point that we have to rely on him, because there's no other option. And that's always the case. We should never be relying on anything other than God, but sometimes that's just kind of natural. But that also excuse me, makes me think of verse 6, kind of like you mentioned, when I remember you upon my bed, and then verse 7, for you have been my help. I think that kind of shows David thinking back on times in his life where, okay, God has brought me out before and he'll do it again. And it's hard to be in situations where that's what we're telling ourselves. Sometimes, we're thinking, I just wish I wasn't in this situation. And that's all we're thinking, is just, I wish life wasn't the way it was. I wish this situation wasn't the way it was. And that's valid, and that's often true. But you kind of see David thinking back and just kind of taking stock of, okay, things are hard, things are rough. I'm in the wilderness, I'm on the run, but God has promised me good things, and God has promised a certain level of comfort and his faithfulness to me. And so really my focus should just be faithfulness to him. So I guess that's kind of the last big practical thing that I would bring out. But.
Well said. I like that. That's a great observation where, oh God, you're my God. That's present tense. For you have been my help, as you said in verse 7. That's past, right? So he's going back to the past. And then he ends the psalm where he says in verse 11, but the king will rejoice in God. Everyone who swears by him will glory, for the mouths of those who speak lies will be stopped. You have past, present, and future. And it's all revolving around who God is and his faithfulness. So that's an excellent observation of looking at David understood this time perspective. And I like that. That's something for us to think about too. As we cry out to God, let's keep in mind this time perspective. He's always been faithful. He will always be faithful. Our response is to continue to trust in him. Thank you, Miles, for that excellent way to end. And thank you for those who are listening. Take care. God bless.